In 2013, a team of Spanish cardiologists looked up from their data and realized they were watching something their profession was not supposed to see. 7,447 older adults, most of them already carrying the weight of high blood pressure, diabetes, and decades of bad cholesterol, had been quietly eating a small handful of mixed nuts every day for almost 5 years. Nothing else about their lives had changed. Their rate of heart attack, stroke, and cardiac death had fallen by nearly 30%. The trial was called PREDIMED, and it was the largest dietary intervention study ever conducted on cardiovascular disease. PREDIMED, 30%. What the Spanish researchers had measured with modern instruments, a man named Jacob had understood 3,000 years earlier. When famine was crushing his household in Genesis 43, he sent his sons back to Egypt with the most precious foods his land could offer. 2 of them were pistachios and almonds. The amino acid inside those nuts is called L-arginine, and it is what your arteries use to stay open. Jacob, L-arginine. They aged differently. The elders of ancient Canaan walked up stone hills at 70 years old on ankles that did not swell. Shepherds in the Judean highlands carried lambs on their shoulders at 80. The men who wrote the Old Testament were not strangers to long life, and they did not achieve it with pharmacies. They achieved it with food that cost almost nothing and grew on trees no one had to plant. Heart disease was so uncommon in the biblical Levant that the ancient medical texts barely describe it. Today it kills more people on Earth than any other cause. Somewhere between their pantry and ours, we stopped eating the small handful of nuts that used to be every meal's quiet foundation. We swapped it for crackers and cheap seed oil and wondered why our arteries hardened faster than our grandparents did. What the prophets and kings and desert mothers ate to keep their hearts quiet is still here, still growing, still carrying the same molecules into the same arteries it always did. Long life. Number 17 on this list was the only nut Aaron's rod produced when it miraculously bloomed in the Book of Numbers. And modern cardiology has found it lowers bad cholesterol more reliably than any other tree nut on earth. Number 9 was stored by Assyrian kings beside their gold, and a single ounce a day has been shown to drop systolic blood pressure by measurable points within weeks. And number 1 is the nut the Song of Solomon names in a walled garden. The one with the highest L-arginine content ever measured in a tree nut. And the one that sits at the heart of the Spanish trial that rewrote what cardiologists thought they knew. Number 17, number 1. These 20 nuts were not supplements. They were not health food. They were the everyday cupboard of every civilization the Old Testament describes. Carried in leather pouches, pressed into oil, ground into paste, crushed into bread, eaten by shepherds and priests and queens and soldiers for thousands of years before the first prescription pad was ever printed. Everyday heart. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down the 20 biblical nuts that quietly protected the human heart before anyone knew what a heart attack was. Subscribe. 20. Terebinth nut. The Hebrew word in Genesis 43 was botnim, and for centuries English translations rendered it vaguely as nuts because no one in cold northern countries knew what it meant. It was the fruit of the terebinth tree, a cousin of the pistachio that grew wild on the rocky hills of Canaan. Shepherd boys cracked them between 2 stones and ate them by the handful on long walks between wells. The oily green kernels carry heavy concentrations of oleic acid, the same monounsaturated fat modern research keeps pointing to as the backbone of the Mediterranean diet. Jacob's sons carried them into Egypt because a pouch of them could feed a man for a full day of walking, without slowing his heart. 19. Chestnut. Genesis 30 mentions Jacob peeling rods of chestnut, hazelnut, and plane to breed stronger flocks. The chestnut is the only tree nut that is starchy rather than oily, more like a grain that happens to grow on a tree. Roman soldiers roasted them in ashes. Italian grandmothers in the 1900s still made flour from chestnuts when wheat was too expensive. The chestnut carries almost no saturated fat, a steady dose of potassium, and soluble fiber that slows the rise of blood sugar after a meal. A heart that does not spike, does not scar. A pouch of roasted chestnuts outside a Roman barracks kept soldiers walking 20 miles a day without the blood pressure crashes that finish men in their 40s. 18. Hazelnut. The same verse that names the chestnut names the hazelnut, and the hazel was one of the most widespread nut trees of the ancient Mediterranean. Roman physicians prescribed crushed hazelnuts in honey for patients whose strength was fading. The nut carries unusually high amounts of vitamin E in its natural gamma-tocopherol form, the kind that slips into artery walls and quiets the inflammation that precedes every heart attack. A Turkish grandmother in the foothills of the Black Sea still offers guests a small bowl of hazelnuts before anything else, because that is what her grandmother did, and because the men in her village reached 80 with hearts that sounded like drums. 17. Almond. The almond is the first nut the Bible mentions by name, and it is named more times than any other. When Aaron's rod miraculously bloomed in the book of Numbers, what it produced was almonds. When Jeremiah saw the first vision of his calling, it was an almond branch. When the temple menorah was designed in Exodus, its cups were shaped like almond blossoms. The almond is rich in the same L-arginine that Jacob's sons carried into Egypt, and it is also the tree nut with the most consistently documented effect on bad cholesterol in clinical literature. 1 ounce a day, roughly 23 almonds, has been shown to drop LDL by measurable points in study after study. The monks who copied manuscripts by candlelight ate almonds every afternoon. They lived on average longer than the nobility they served. 16. Pine nut. Isaiah 41 names the oil tree among the trees the Lord plants in the wilderness, and many scholars believe the oil tree was the stone pine, whose cones held the soft white seed we now call the pine nut. Roman legions carried them into battle because a small handful kept a soldier steady on a long march. The pine nut carries a rare fatty acid called panolenic acid, which modern research has connected to appetite regulation and lower triglyceride levels. A triglyceride is a fat that floats in your blood after a meal, and the higher it runs, the harder your heart works. Pine nuts, eaten the Roman way, slowed that fat down. 15. Carob. When the Gospel of Matthew says John the Baptist ate locusts and wild honey in the wilderness, a long Eastern tradition holds that the locusts were the pods of the carob tree, which in Greek was called the locust tree. The seeds inside those pods are so uniformly weighted that they became the original measure of the carrot. Modern studies on carob pulp have shown measurable reductions in total cholesterol after 4 weeks of daily intake, driven by the soluble fiber and polyphenols that bind cholesterol in the gut before it can ever reach the bloodstream. A prophet in the desert was not eating locusts. He was eating the seed pod that keeps arteries clean. 14. Date pit. The date palm is mentioned more than 30 times in the Old Testament, and its fruit was the sweetness that carried desert travelers across Sinai. What no one talks about is the pit. Bedouin families roasted date pits, ground them into a dark coffee, and drank it every morning for generations. Modern research on roasted date seed has found heavy concentrations of polyphenols that boost the body's own production of nitric oxide, the molecule that tells your blood vessels to open. Every morning, in every tent, a grandmother was grinding what the rest of the world threw in the trash. 13. Fig seed. When Jesus saw Nathanael under the fig tree in the first chapter of John, he was observing a scene that was common in every Judean garden. The fig was a daily food. It was also a daily delivery system for its seeds, which carry the potassium and soluble fiber that modern cardiology has spent the last 30 years trying to put back into American diets. A single dried fig carries more potassium than a teaspoon of salt can undo. The shepherds who sat under fig trees at midday were not just cooling off. They were dosing themselves with the mineral that keeps a heart's rhythm steady. 12. Pomegranate seed. The pomegranate was embroidered on the hem of the high priest's robe in Exodus 28, one of the few foods sacred enough to decorate the garment of the man who entered the Holy of Holies. Each pomegranate carries hundreds of seeds wrapped in ruby jelly. Those seeds contain a compound called punicalagin, and a long line of clinical research now shows that daily pomegranate intake improves the function of the endothelium, the thin lining inside every blood vessel, within weeks. A priest who ate pomegranate before temple service was preparing his body the way modern cardiologists now prepare patients before surgery. 11. Acorn. Genesis 35 names the oak of weeping where Deborah was buried, and the oaks of ancient Israel dropped their acorns the same way the oaks of California still do. Properly leached to remove the tannins, the acorn becomes a dense, nutty flour that Native American and ancient Israelite peoples both turned it into daily bread. The acorn is one of the few nuts that carries significant amounts of soluble fiber in the same bite as its oil, a combination that slows the absorption of cholesterol and glucose at the same time. A people who ate acorn bread did not develop the sharp, jagged blood sugar curves that scar the inside of arteries. 10. Black cumin seed. Isaiah 28 describes the threshing of cumin, and for 3,000 years across the Middle East, black cumin seed has been called the seed that cures everything but death. The seed carries a compound called thymoquinone that has been shown in human trials to reduce both systolic and diastolic blood pressure after 8 weeks of daily intake. Bedouin grandmothers chewed a teaspoon every morning on an empty stomach. They did not know the word thymoquinone. They only knew that the men in their tents who ate it walked into their 90s with hearts that did not quit. 9. Pistachio. Genesis 43 names the pistachio as one of the 2 nuts Jacob chose first. Assyrian kings stored them in the royal granaries beside the gold. A clinical trial published in Hypertension in 2012 found that 1.5 ounces of pistachios per day reduced systolic blood pressure by almost 5 points in adults with elevated cholesterol. That is not a supplement effect. That is a food effect, matching what L-arginine does when it enters the bloodstream and tells the arteries to widen. The kings of Nineveh were not eating pistachios because they tasted good. They were eating them because their court physicians had noticed over generations that the men who ate them aged more slowly. 8. Flax seed. Exodus 9 describes the flax being ruined by the plague of hail, and the grief of losing the flax crop was described in the same breath as losing the barley, because flax was food before it was ever linen. A tablespoon of ground flax carries more alpha-linolenic acid than almost anything else on Earth, the plant-based omega-3 that modern research has connected to reduced risk of fatal cardiac arrhythmia. The women of Galilee ground it into their morning bread every day of a marriage. What they were eating was the same molecule Greenland Inuit ate in fish oil from a plant that grew on dry land. 7. Mustard seed. When Jesus called the mustard seed the smallest of seeds in Matthew 13, he was pointing at something that was already on every family's table. The whole mustard seed carries glucosinolates, compounds that break down into isothiocyanates in the gut, and they have been linked to reduced inflammation in blood vessel walls. A small seed, a small effect per seed, But a lifetime of small seeds adds up to the kind of arterial health that the developed world is now spending billions of dollars trying to buy in pill form. 6. Sesame seed. The Talmud calls sesame one of the pillars of a long life. Assyrian kings drank sesame wine. Babylonian soldiers carried sesame paste on long marches. The seed contains a compound called sesamin, which reduces cholesterol oxidation, the step that turns ordinary LDL into the arterial plaque that kills. A Mediterranean grandmother, crushing sesame into tahini every week, was doing what no cholesterol medication has ever quite matched. She was preventing the damage before it began. 5. Coriander seed. When the Israelites compared the manna in the wilderness to something familiar, what they chose was coriander seed. Exodus 16 names it directly. Modern clinical work on coriander seed has found measurable reductions in LDL cholesterol and total cholesterol after daily intake for a month. The spice drawer most Americans ignore was once the standard by which the bread of heaven was described. 4. Caraway seed. Isaiah 28 lists caraway alongside cumin in its description of threshing. And the caraway has been a daily seed in Middle Eastern and Central European kitchens for 4,000 years. The seed carries carvone, a compound that relaxes smooth muscle in the walls of blood vessels, and its traditional use in peasant bread was not decoration. It was medicine, delivered one slice at a time. 3. Fenugreek seed. Fenugreek was widespread across the ancient Levant and Egypt. Egyptian priests embalmed pharaohs with it. Roman women ate it to keep their hair dark. The seeds soaked overnight in cold water carry galactomannan, a soluble fiber. Modern trials have shown that daily intake reduces both total cholesterol and triglycerides after 8 weeks. A clay cup of soaked fenugreek cost a copper in biblical Jericho. A statin prescription today costs far more and does less for the blood vessel wall itself. 2. Cumin seed. Isaiah chapter 28 names cumin. Matthew chapter 23 lists it among the herbs the Pharisees tithed. Modern research on cumin has found measurable reductions in total cholesterol and triglycerides after 8 weeks of daily intake, driven by a compound called cuminaldehyde. Every Middle Eastern stew, every pot of lentils, every cracked lamb bone simmering in a clay pot carried cumin, and with it, the slow, quiet protection of the small vessels that feed the heart muscle itself. 1. Walnut. When the Song of Solomon describes the lover going down to the Garden of Nuts, the Hebrew word is egos, and scholars across centuries have translated it as the walnut. The walnut is the only tree nut with significant alpha-linolenic acid, and it carries more L-arginine than any other nut ever measured. A study published in Circulation in 2004, led by Emilio Ros at the Hospital Clinic of Barcelona, showed that substituting walnuts for part of a Mediterranean diet improved the function of the endothelium, the inside lining of the arteries, within 4 weeks. The PREDIMED trial that this list began with, the one that cut cardiovascular events by 30%, included walnuts as the centerpiece of its mixed nut allotment. The lover in the Garden of Nuts was not being poetic. He was describing the most powerful heart food ever to grow on a tree. Jacob did not know the word L-arginine. He did not know what nitric oxide was or what the endothelium did inside an artery wall. He only knew from 3 generations of watching the men in his tribe grow old that the ones who ate a small handful of pistachios and almonds every day walked upright into their 9th decade, while the ones who did not, did not. 3,000 years later, a trial in Spain proved him right to the decimal point. The prescription was written in Genesis. The refill is in your pantry. 1 small handful a day, the same amount that fits in the palm of a hand, the same amount Jacob sent to Egypt, the same amount PREDIMED tested. That is all. That is everything. The molecule that kept the hearts of shepherds quiet is still doing its quiet work. You just have to open the jar.